In 480 BCE, Leonidas and 300 Spartans walked into a narrow pass, knowing they might never return. For 3 days, they stood between Greece and the largest empire the Greeks had ever seen. Then came the betrayal. A mountain path was revealed. Persian troops moved behind the Greek line. The pass was lost. Leonidas fell. His body was fought over. The last defenders were surrounded and buried under arrows. To Xerxes, Thermopylae looked like victory. The road south opened. Athens was abandoned, captured, and burned. The Persian king had crossed from Asia into Europe, broken the first Greek defense, and watched the greatest city in Attica go up in flames. But Thermopylae was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of Sparta's revenge, because 1 year later, Sparta returned, not with 300 men. With 5,000 Spartiates, thousands of Lacedaemonian troops, helot attendants, and the largest Greek land army yet gathered against Persia. At Plataea, under the command of Pausanias, the Greeks would face Mardonius, the general Xerxes had left behind to finish the conquest. This time, Sparta would not be trapped in a pass. This time, the full weight of the Spartan war machine would stand in the open, and the empire that killed Leonidas would learn what happened when Sparta came back with everything it had. This is the road from Thermopylae to Plataea, a story of defeat turned into vengeance, a story of a burned city, a desperate naval victory, a year of fear, and the final land battle that ended Xerxes' invasion. To understand Plataea, we have to begin with Xerxes. By 480 BCE, the Persian Empire was the greatest power in the known world. It stretched across peoples, languages, armies, fleets, roads, tribute, and royal authority on a scale no Greek city-state could match. Greece was smaller, divided, and often at war with itself. Athens and Sparta did not trust each other. Many cities hesitated. Some chose resistance. Some considered submission. Others waited to see which side would survive. That was the weakness Xerxes hoped to exploit. His father, Darius, had already tried to punish Athens and Eretria after the Ionian revolt, but the Persian expedition had been defeated at Marathon in 490 BCE. To the Greeks, Marathon became proof that Persia could be beaten. To Persia, it was unfinished business. Xerxes returned to finish it. This time, the invasion would not be a raid. It would be overwhelming. The Persians crossed from Asia into Europe, moved through Thrace and Macedon, and advanced toward Greece with a massive army and fleet. Ancient numbers are famously exaggerated and debated, but the strategic reality was clear. Persia could bring resources no single Greek city could match. The Greeks had to choose where to resist. They could not defend every road, every coast, every city, and every valley. They needed terrain that could reduce Persia's size. On land, the key was Thermopylae. The pass was narrow, squeezed between mountain and sea. In that kind of place, Persian numbers mattered less. A smaller force could hold the road if discipline did not break. At the same time, the Greek fleet would operate near Artemisium, trying to block the Persian navy and prevent the land defense from being turned by sea. The strategy was connected. If the pass held, the fleet could stay. If the fleet held, the pass could not be bypassed easily. If either failed, the whole defense might collapse. Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 kings, led the force to Thermopylae. He did not come alone. The famous 300 Spartans were part of a wider Greek contingent, allies from several cities, including Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and others. But the symbolic center of the defense was Leonidas and his Spartans. Sparta had spent generations building men for exactly this kind of moment. The Yagogi had trained them to endure. The common mess had bound them together. The shield line had taught them that one man breaking could endanger all. At Thermopylae, that system stood in the narrow road before Xerxes. For 2 days, the Persian assaults failed to break the Greek position. The terrain did what the Greeks needed it to do. The pass compressed the attackers. Persian cavalry could not simply ride around the defenders. Numbers could not be used all at once. The Greek hoplites fought in close order, with heavier armor, longer spears, and discipline suited to the narrow ground. Even elite Persian troops struggled to force the passage. To the Persians, this must have been maddening. They had the greater empire, the larger army, the king of kings watching the battle, and yet the road was held by a line of men who refused to move. But Thermopylae had a weakness. A path through the mountains could turn the position. According to Herodotus, a local man named Ephialtes revealed the route to Xerxes. Some modern historians are cautious about the details because Persian scouts may have been able to find such routes themselves. But in Greek memory, Ephialtes became the traitor who opened the road behind Leonidas. During the night, Persian troops moved along the mountain path. The Greeks guarding the route were forced aside or bypassed. By morning, Leonidas knew the position was lost. What happened next is one of the hardest moments in Greek history to separate from legend. Some Greek forces withdrew, others stayed. Herodotus gives different possibilities for why Leonidas remained. Perhaps obedience to an oracle, perhaps the need to cover the retreat, perhaps Spartan law, perhaps the simple reality that escape was no longer possible. What matters is that Leonidas stayed with the 300 Spartans. The Thespians also remained, choosing to fight to the end. The Thebans remained too, though later Greek writers argued bitterly about their motives and conduct. The last stand began. The Greeks moved forward into a more open part of the pass, trying to kill as many Persians as possible before the end. Spears broke, swords came out. The fight became closer and more desperate. Then Leonidas fell. Around his body, the battle turned savage. Herodotus says the Greeks drove the Persians back several times in the struggle to recover the king's corpse. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by heroic memory, the meaning was clear to later Greeks. Leonidas had not died hidden behind the line. He had died in front of it. At last, the surviving defenders withdrew to a small hill. There, surrounded from front and rear, they were killed by Persian missiles. Thermopylae was over. Xerxes had won the pass. According to Herodotus, he ordered Leonidas's body mutilated after the battle, a shocking act in Greek eyes, and one that made the Spartan king's death even more powerful in memory. But the military result was immediate. The road into central Greece was open. Artemisium could no longer be held. The Greek fleet withdrew. The Persians moved south. Athens now faced the consequence. The Athenians had already made a hard decision. Under the influence of Themistocles and the famous idea of the wooden walls, they evacuated much of the population. The city itself could not be saved by stone walls against the Persian advance. When the Persians entered Athens, they found a city largely abandoned. They captured the Acropolis after resistance there and burned the city. For Greece, this was a psychological disaster. Thermopylae had fallen, Athens had burned. Xerxes could look at the campaign and see success. If the story had ended there, Leonidas would have been remembered as a brave man who failed, and Athens as a city destroyed by choosing resistance. But the Greek fleet still existed, and Themistocles understood that Persia's size could become a weakness at sea, just as it had been limited on land at Thermopylae. He needed the Persian fleet in narrow water, not in the open, not with room to surround the Greeks. Near Salamis, the Greeks drew the Persians into straits where too many ships became a problem. Triremes needed space to row, turn, and strike with their bronze rams. In cramped water, a great fleet could become crowded, confused, and vulnerable. Salamis should not be told here in every detail, because this is Sparta's road to Plataea. But without Salamis, Plataea never happens. The Greek fleet struck hard. Persian ships lost order. The narrow straits turned Themistocles' plan into a weapon. Xerxes watched a naval disaster from the shore. Salamis did not destroy Persia's entire power, but it changed the invasion. Xerxes could no longer assume that his fleet could safely support the army everywhere. His supply situation became more dangerous. His hold on the campaign weakened. So Xerxes made a strategic decision. He returned to Asia with part of his forces, leaving Mardonius in command of the army that remained in Greece. This is the moment people often forget. After Salamis, the war was not over. The Persian army was still dangerous. Mardonius still held enough force to threaten the Greek mainland. Athens had been burned, but Greece had not been conquered. The decisive land battle was still ahead. Mardonius was one of Persia's strongest commanders. He understood that Greece might be broken not only by weapons, but by politics. He wintered in the north and prepared to continue the war in 479 BCE. He also tried diplomacy. If Athens could be separated from Sparta and the other Greeks, the resistance might fracture. This was a real danger. Athens was exhausted. Its city had been destroyed. Its people had fled once already. Its land was exposed again if the Persians returned. The Athenians had carried much of the naval burden at Salamis, but on land they could not save Attica alone. Sparta, protected behind the Peloponnese and the Isthmus, could think defensively.
Athens could not. Mardonius offered terms. The Athenians could make peace. They could recover their land. They could avoid another destruction. But accepting Persian friendship would split the Greek alliance and leave Sparta isolated behind the Isthmus. The Athenians refused. The choice was extraordinary. Athens had the most obvious reason to compromise. Its houses, farms, and sanctuaries had already paid the price of resistance. Its people had slept as refugees while their city burned. Persia could offer restoration. Sparta could only offer promises. But if Athens submitted, the Greek fleet might collapse, and Persia could use Athenian ships, harbors, and manpower against the rest of Greece. So Athens held. That decision forced Sparta's hand. The Spartans had built defenses at the Isthmus of Corinth and could imagine a war fought behind the wall, protecting the Peloponnese while Attica suffered. But that strategy had a weakness. Without Athens and the fleet, even the Peloponnese might eventually be isolated. The Greek alliance could not survive if its two strongest members stopped trusting each other. So the Spartans moved. And when they moved in a way that showed the scale of the moment. They chose resistance again, but they also demanded action. If Sparta and the Peloponnesians stayed behind their defensive wall at the Isthmus, Athens might be sacrificed for the survival of the Peloponnese. That was not an alliance, that was abandonment. In 479 BCE, Mardonius returned south and entered Attica once more. Athens was evacuated again.
The city suffered again. Now, the pressure on Sparta became impossible to ignore. If the Greeks were going to end the invasion, they had to fight on land. And this time, Sparta mobilized on a scale that changed the meaning of the war. According to Herodotus, Sparta sent 5,000 Spartiates to the campaign, each attended by helots, along with thousands of other Lacedaemonian hoplites. This was not a symbolic royal guard. It was the largest Spartan citizen force we hear of in the Persian wars. At Thermopylae, Leonidas had stood with 300. At Plataea, Sparta came back with the strength of the state. The commander was Pausanias. He was not Leonidas, but he was tied to him by blood and by duty. Pausanias was a member of the Spartan royal house, the son of Cleombrotus, and regent for Pleistarchus, the young son of Leonidas. In other words, the man who led the Greeks at Plataea stood in the shadow of the king who had died at Thermopylae. That mattered.
This was not only strategy, it was memory. It was the unfinished business of 480 BCE. This is why Plataea must be seen as more than a second battle after Thermopylae. It was the moment when Sparta's sacrifice turned into Sparta's responsibility. The dead had given the living a duty. Leonidas had shown Greece how a Spartan king could die. Pausanias now had to show how a Spartan commander could win. The Greek army gathered from many city-states: Spartans, Tegeans, Athenians, Corinthians, Megarians, Plataeans, and others. Herodotus gives huge numbers, and modern scholars debate the exact totals, but there is no doubt that this was one of the largest Greek land forces ever assembled. The army moved into Boeotia, near Plataea, below the slopes of Mount Citaron. This location mattered. Mountains, foothills, rivers, and open ground created a battlefield where each side wanted something different. Across from the Greeks stood Mardonius. He had chosen ground that suited Persian strengths: more open terrain for cavalry, room for archers, and access to a fortified camp north of the Esopus River. The Greeks preferred rougher ground near the hills, where hoplites could resist cavalry and force close combat. So the armies watched each other. Neither side wanted to give up the terrain that protected it. This waiting was not weakness, it was calculation. Mardonius wanted the Greeks drawn onto the plain. Pausanias wanted to avoid being broken by Persian cavalry before the hoplites could do their work.
For days, the battle did not fully begin. To soldiers, waiting can be worse than fighting. Men stood under the summer sun. Scouts watched the enemy. Commanders argued over position. Every movement could be a trap. Every delay gave fear more time to spread. Then, Persian cavalry started applying pressure. They attacked exposed Greek units. They harassed the lines. They threatened supplies. A Persian cavalry commander, Marcistius, was killed in an early clash, a morale boost for the Greeks. But the cavalry problem did not disappear. Mardonius used mobility to make the Greek position harder to sustain. Supply lines were hit. Water became a crisis. The Persians fouled or blocked access to the Gargaphia Spring, one of the Greek army's key water sources. This was exactly the kind of pressure that could break a coalition. A Spartan could endure thirst. An Athenian could endure danger. A Tegean could endure delay. But could all of them endure it together, under one command, while each city feared that another might abandon the plan? Now Pausanias had to move. The Greeks planned a night withdrawal to a better position closer to Plataea, where they could regain access to water and supplies. But moving a huge coalition army at night is dangerous. The withdrawal became confused. Different contingents moved at different times. Some delayed, some went too far, some remained exposed. By dawn, the Greek line was no longer a clean formation. To Mardonius, it looked like the Greeks were retreating. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He ordered the attack. The Persian army advanced. Cavalry and archers pressed the isolated Greek units. The Spartans and Tegeans found themselves under heavy pressure before the whole Greek army had properly reformed. This was the crisis of Plataea. The Greeks had not chosen the perfect moment. They had stumbled into danger. Pausanias, according to Herodotus, waited for favorable sacrifices before committing fully. To modernize, this can look like hesitation. To a Spartan commander, divine approval and discipline were part of command. But the delay increased the tension. Persian arrows fell. The Spartans held their shields, endured the missile fire, and waited. Men were hit, the lines suffered, the pressure rose. Imagine the contrast with Thermopylae. At Thermopylae, the Spartans had waited in a narrow pass until the enemy came to them. At Plataea, they stood on broken ground while Persian missiles fell and Mardonius pressed forward, believing the Greeks were finally coming apart. This was the moment when Sparta's reputation had to become real again, not in legend, not in memory, in the field. Then the sacrifices turned favorable. Pausanias ordered the advance. the Spartan and Tegean hoplites moved forward. This was the moment Mardonius had to fear.
At distance, Persian archers and cavalry could punish the Greeks. At close range, heavily armored hoplites were far more dangerous. The Spartans and Tegeans closed the distance under fire. Persian troops fought behind wicker shields and with courage, but once the battle became hand-to-hand combat, the advantage shifted. Greek spears, armor, shields, and formation discipline began to tell. The fighting was hard. The Persians did not simply vanish. Mardonius was no coward. He stayed in the battle, fighting from horseback with his guard around him. As long as he lived, the Persian army had a center. Then Mardonius was killed. Herodotus says he was struck by a stone thrown by a Spartan named Eremnestus. Whether the detail is exact or not, his death changed everything. The Persian command structure broke. The men who had followed Mardonius now faced the collapse of the battle around them. The Persian line began to give way.
Some fled toward the fortified camp. Others were cut down in the retreat. On another part of the field, the Athenians fought pro-Persian Greeks, including Thebans. This mattered because Plataea was not simply Greece against Persia. It was also a civil struggle inside the Greek world between resistance, survival, collaboration, and calculation. Eventually, the Greeks stormed the Persian camp. The invasion that had begun with Xerxes crossing into Europe now died in a camp near Plataea. Thermopylae had been avenged, but the revenge was not simple. Pausanias did not mutilate Mardonius the way Xerxes had treated Leonidas, at least according to later tradition. When urged to take revenge on the corpse, he refused. That refusal mattered. It allowed the Greeks to say that their victory was not only military, but moral. Leonidas had been dishonored by the enemy. Mardonius would not be dishonored by Pausanias. Sparta's answer would be given on the battlefield, not on a corpse. Leonidas had died in a pass. Mardonius died in open battle. The 300 had been overwhelmed. A year later, 5,000 Spartiates and their allies broke the army left to complete Persia's conquest of Greece. Plataea was the answer to Thermopylae. It was the proof that a delaying action, a burned capital, and a naval gamble had all led to one final land decision. Not because it erased the defeat. Nothing could bring Leonidas back. Nothing could unburn Athens. Nothing could remove the terror of 480 BCE. But Plataea changed the meaning of everything that had happened before it. Thermopylae was no longer only the story of a doomed last stand. It became the first act of a larger Greek victory. The pass had bought time. Salamis had broken the momentum of the Persian fleet. Plataea destroyed the land army that remained. And on or around the same period, across the Aegean, another blow fell. At Mycale, near the coast of Asia Minor, the Greek fleet under Spartan king Leonidas and other commanders confronted Persian forces. The Persians had drawn their ships up on shore and fortified their position, but the Greeks attacked and won. Mycale mattered because it carried the war back toward Ionia. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, whose revolt decades earlier had helped begin the conflict, now saw Persian power shaken again. The same year that Mardonius fell at Plataea, Persian control of the Aegean frontier was badly damaged.
The invasion was over. Persia would remain a great empire. The war between Greeks and Persians would continue in different forms, but Xerxes' attempt to subdue mainland Greece had failed. And the city that stood at the center of the final land victory was Sparta. This is the story's central irony. At Thermopylae, Sparta became immortal through defeat. At Plataea, Sparta became decisive through victory. The 300 are remembered because they died. The 5,000 are less famous because they won. It took the grief of 480 BCE and turned it into a verdict delivered in 479 BCE. But without Plataea, Thermopylae would have been only a heroic disaster.
Without the return of Sparta in 479 BCE, Leonidas's death might have become the symbol of Greek failure, not Greek resistance.
Instead, the story changed. The Spartans who died in the past became the oath. That is the heart of this story. The Spartans who marched to Plataea became the answer. 1 year separated the two moments. In the first, a small force held a narrow road until it was surrounded. In the second, a full Greek army under Spartan leadership stood in Boeotia and ended the invasion on land. The Persian Empire had learned how difficult it was to break Greeks in a pass. At Plataea, it learned how dangerous Greek hoplites could be in the open when Sparta finally committed its strength. But the victory also revealed something about Greece. No city had won alone. Sparta led the land army, but Athens had held the fleet together and fought at Salamis. The Thesbians had died at Thermopylae. The Plataeans had stood with Athens. The Tegeans fought beside the Spartans. Many cities sent men to the final battle. Greek freedom survived because rivalry was, for a moment, forced into cooperation. Still, the memory of the war would not be shared equally. Sparta would remember Leonidas. Athens would remember Salamis. Plataea would remember the field where the invasion ended. And Persia would remember that Greece, divided and small, had refused to become another province. For Sparta, the meaning was especially powerful. Its whole system had been built for land war. The agoge, the messes, the discipline, the kingship, the alliance network, the expectation that a Spartiate must hold his place. At Thermopylae, that system created men who could die without breaking. At Plataea, it created an army that could return and win. That is why the road from Thermopylae to Plataea matters. It is not just the story of revenge, it is the story of transformation. A defeat became a rallying memory. A burned city became a reason to continue. A naval victory bought the time needed for a land decision. A dead king's shadow followed his nephew onto the battlefield. And when Mardonius fell, the invasion lost the man Xerxes had trusted to finish the war. After Plataea and Mycale, the Persians withdrew from the dream of conquering mainland Greece. The Greeks had survived, but survival did not create peace. In the decades that followed, Athens would build a maritime empire. Sparta would watch with suspicion. The alliance that had resisted Persia would eventually fracture. The Greek world saved from Xerxes would later turn its weapons against itself. But that is another story. For now, the meaning is clear. In 480 BCE, Leonidas and the 300 died at Thermopylae. The pass fell. Athens burned. Xerxes seemed unstoppable, but Sparta was not finished. A year later, under Pausanias, the Spartans returned with the largest force they had yet committed. They stood with the Greek allies at Plataea. They killed Mardonius. They broke the Persian army, and they ended the invasion Leonidas had tried to delay. The 300 gave Greece time. The fleet at Salamis gave Greece hope. But Plataea gave Greece the victory. And when the dust settled on that field in 479 BCE, the message was impossible to miss. Leonidas had fallen, but Sparta had come back. And this time, Persia did not pass, and Greece heard it clearly.